All right, we're going to get started. My pleasure today to have Tom Bruce give our seminar. No worries. So I'm going to start with a acknowledgement of country. The University of Queensland acknowledges traditional owners and their custodianship of the lands on which we meet. We pay our respects to their ancestors and their descendants who continue cultural and spiritual connections to country. We recognize their valuable contributions to Australian and global society. With that, I'll introduce Tom. Tom's had a really interesting career that was captured very well by Kate in the recent CBCS News letter.
Bonnie.
I think a lot of people might have seen that he has experiences all over the world studying really cool animals from Mongolia, Tanzania to Cameroon, where I first came across his work in a very beautiful forest called the Jaw. He has a master's from England, Royal Veterinary College, and then he worked for ZSL, Zoological Society of London, for years. That was where he was based in Cameroon. He was sampling for a variety of large charismatic megafauna in the Congo Basin, things like gorillas, chimps, and elephants, and giant pangolin. Then he came here to JCU to do his PhD, where he focused on cats in rainforests in the wet tropics of Queensland. Then he came down here and started his postdoc with CBCS. And he's been here for 18 months, 2 years?
Over 2 years now.
Great. So Tom was instrumental in writing a variety of proposals to get the Wildlife Observatory funded and showed incredible persistence when those got rejected and then finally funded. And so he is a co-founder and was there from the start on this project. And now it's really exciting because he is also the first one who hands on the data and get some preliminary analyses. And he's going after a really controversial topic where hopefully we're going to attract a lot of interest and get people coming to the observatory. And so he's going to talk to us today about cats, dingoes, and foxes in Australia. Thank you, Tom.
Thank you, Matthew. That was much too much chat about me for me to feel comfortable with. But thank you, everyone, for coming today. As Matthew said, my name's Tom, and I'm here to speak to you today on behalf of the Wildlife Observatory about dingo, fox, and cat interactions in Australia. So a bit of background for everyone in the room and online about what WildObs or the Wildlife Observatory actually is. It's a national level wildlife database that will deliver information for robust monitoring, science, and management. What that means in layperson's terms is that we really need a national wildlife database to feed indices like the Threatened Species Index, provide good recommendations and management for threatened species strategies and invasive species, as well as helping Australian scientists deliver cutting-edge peer-reviewed publications like those in Nature, as well as feeding other large databases like the Atlas of Living Australia and other reports like those done by the UN. As we all know, if you've ever carried out a camera trapping survey, it's super easy to gather loads of data, but to actually turn it around in time and make something useful from it is super hard. And as we know, in Australia, dramatic events are increasing in frequency. We're seeing more bushfires, disease outbreaks,
types of stone that we could use to tile.
We're really a platform that can deliver modelling to managers in a timely and reasonable manner so that you can actually make implications, inferences, and better manage our native species. Again, a little bit of background as to why WildObs. So when we started the project, the first thing we needed to understand really was where are the camera trap surveys in Australia and how many are there? And we actually carried out a really big literature review and questionnaire to get to the bottom of that. So these are some figures from that. It's in press, it's coming out soon. But what these green dots are showing you is points that where camera trap surveys were carried out based on just asking people, where have you surveyed? The black dots are literature items from peer-reviewed publications, again showing camera trap surveys, and they're scaled to the number of cameras that were put there. In all, what you can see here is there is lots of different sources of camera trap data within Australia, and we were pleasantly surprised by that because it means we've got something to work with. We're not starting from nothing. Now, what we also wanted to understand was there any evidence, and what we were hoping for is an exponential increase in the number of camera trap publications through time. So time is on the bottom axis here, and the number of studies is on the Y. And the black is the year of publication. We were hoping for a nice exponential increase as people begin to use AI modeling to process their data faster, and hopefully people were getting on top of the problem. Sadly, we only saw a linear increase, and that really motivated us more because it's clear there might be a backlog in actually using all of this camera trap data for good inferences. And that's why we really pushed to make the observatory happen. Another potential problem is that by having these surveys sporadically placed out, people often study the same research question in a slightly different environment, or even the same place, and that leads to redundancy. So a lot of money and effort goes into each of these surveys, And some of them can lack power and statistical nuance, as we often need surveys carrying out through time. So what we really need in Australia is a linked up network to bring all of these data sets together and then begin to model trends in species populations. And this is where this first example of WildObs comes into it. What we're actually going to do is try and take on one of the biggest conservation questions in Australia, is there any evidence that dingoes can affect the abundance or activity of foxes and cats? Now, to give you a bit of background on this, we're going to go into Australia's extinction record, which sadly is not that great. Australia has one of the worst extinction records as a modern country. And since colonisation, as of 2019, there's been around 100 extinctions of species. This figure on the right really highlights that. This is just the number of extinct mammals, with darker cells in these ecoregions showing you areas with more extinctions. Now, feral cats and foxes are thought to be some of the primary drivers of these extinctions and have been implicated as the main responsible source for over 20 native species. And dingoes come into the story here. They were naturalized in Australia over 10,000 years ago, and there is some evidence they might be able to influence fox and cat populations, as shown in these images here, which has led people to propose that actually you could potentially use dingoes as a natural management source for foxes and cats. Throughout the country today, wildlife management focuses generally on trapping, baiting, and shooting for foxes and cats, which is hideously expensive and definitely not as effective as it could be in some places. So some people think that by promoting dingoes, you could save a lot of money, time, and resources to achieve the same goal. Now, as a bit of background as to the sort of extent of fox and cat impacts to really contextualize this debate, in Australia today, we think there's about 1.7 million foxes in the country. And their distribution is shown in this map here, with dark areas showing densities of foxes greater than 1 individual per kilometre squared. You can see that they're distributed throughout the whole country, but haven't really made it to islands. And then in the Northern Territory and far north Queensland, we think that they're largely absent, and this is predominantly thought to be due to high temperature and high humidity combining together to prevent the spread of foxes up there. Feral cats, on the other hand, despite showing less of a sort of noticeable density map compared to foxes, you'll notice are distributed throughout the entire country, including islands like Tasmania and the Tiwi Islands up in the north here. What this means in terms of being a native species is that nowhere is really safe from the threat of a mesopredator on the entirety of Australia. This map here makes a pretty grim reading. You can see that the combined fox and cat density is actually really high in the south of Australia, but you can't go anywhere without experiencing the threat from one of these species. Now, in terms of what this might look like in numbers, some papers have predicted that it's thought that feral cats and foxes together consume annually around 700 million reptiles, 510 million birds, 1,435 million mammals. So as you'll all agree, that's a really huge impact and a good enough motivation as to why we should be looking into their populations. Now, as I've inferred earlier, whether predators can suppress one another is a clear sort of line of debate within the literature here, and people think that dingoes could be conferring benefits to native species through 3 mechanisms. The main one being excluding cats and foxes from areas in space, so extirpating them from habitats, creating nice refugia for native fauna free from the threat of mesopredators. They could be exerting their influence on fox and cats through the time of the day that fox and cats are active. If fox and cats are avoiding dingoes in time, you create a time during the day where native fauna can forage free of the threat of predation from cats and foxes. And finally, the other mechanism is dingoes could actually be directly killing both of these mesopredators, either for food or just because predators generally don't like living with other predators and will kill them just as an antagonistic process rather than to eat them. And what we can see here through all these papers flying up in front of you is that there's clearly lots of debate around this issue, and people have made their entire careers from arguing one way or the other about it. Now, bringing all of the data as an observatory together, we're hoping that everyone is going to be right in their individual contexts, and then when we look at it at a broader scale, there might be a slightly more nuanced picture that we can draw out, but that everybody gets the answer they sort of wanted to hear, and everyone can then move forward and start looking at a new debate rather than rehashing old ground. So now to bring all of this back a little bit to some fundamental ecological theory to keep everyone on the same page as I sort of move through this discussion, I wanted to highlight that being the middle predator in a food web is a pretty rubbish existence overall. Not only do you have to make sure that you can move through the environment, find, successfully hunt, capture, and consume prey species, you also have to make sure that you don't become dinner or moved out of your environment for somebody else. So the theory here is that by promoting populations of dingoes, you could exert a downward pressure on foxes and cats, reducing their abundance, reducing their ability to acquire resources, thus reducing the pressure on prey species at the bottom of the food web and promoting their overall conservation. So really, the hit home from here is, yeah, being the middle predator is really difficult, and I don't envy them. Now, if you're a mesopredator living in a habitat patch, you need to consider how can you avoid becoming dinner for somebody else. Now, anti-predator strategies are generally split into two theories. They either occur in space or time. So the first thing you can do is avoid sites occupied by your predator. What this means on the ground is if you were living in a forest patch, you could move to a different forest patch that the predator isn't in because maybe it's more fragmented. And a really nice example of this comes from Madagascar, where the domestic dog actually pushed the falanook, this little native fox that's sucking on a worm there, out of fragmented rainforest patches. So the falanook moved away from areas occupied by the domestic dog into larger contiguous patches of rainforest. If you can't move out of your habitat patch and you have to live with your co-occurring apex predator, you could alter your activity to reduce the chance of an encounter. So if the apex predator is nocturnal and you're diurnal, you're living in the same habitat patch, but you're reducing the chance of coming together head to head and having that negative interaction. A great example of this is the American mink, which is invasive in the UK. And throughout the 1990s, it was predominantly nocturnal. However, in the 2000s, in response to increasing otter populations, it actually totally switched its activity pattern to become diurnal, so it reduced its chance of encountering the otter in the river systems of the UK. Now, back to my sort of pyramid of mesopredators, this represents a really big trade-off. It's not like you're a herbivore, grass is always out, so you can be diurnal, nocturnal, it's always going to be there. However, as a mesopredator, not only do you have to make sure that your activity pattern overlaps with your prey, you want to try and avoid that apex predator. So if your prey and the apex are nocturnal, you can't simply become diurnal because then you're denying yourself a food resource. So it's a really complicated process that requires a lot of good thinking and a lot of data to model out what is actually going on in the dynamics of these systems. So today I'm going to talk through three sort of broad hypotheses about the project, and at the end I'll come to some other larger ones that we haven't got around to answering yet, but we plan to. So the first topic I'm going to talk about is environmental segregation. So we're looking whether there's any evidence that the three predators are separate based on ecological gradients like rainfall or elevation. Every time I'm talking about that, you'll see this little logo in the top left corner of the slide. The next thing we're going to talk about is whether there's any evidence that increasing abundance of dingoes drives a decrease in the abundance of foxes or cats. And every time I talk about that, you'll see this little symbol up in the top left corner. And then the final thing we're going to test is any evidence of temporal niche differentiation. So the first thing we're going to look at is whether there's any evidence that the predators are just temporarily segregated, so everyone's active at a different time of day. And then we're also, to try and strengthen our arguments around that, we're going to look at something called temporal displacement. So do the mesopredators change their activity in landscape so the dominant predator is present versus absent? So to do this, we've had to gather arguably one of the largest data sets in Australia in terms of camera trapping effort. And what I really want to hit home here is every little point is somebody's blood, sweat, tears, money, time, and so much effort gone through just to derive one data set that could be used to answer one question like, is a potteroo present or absent here? But you get all of this bycatch, which is everything else that goes past the camera that could be used for something else if you amalgamate it all into one big observatory like we're proposing to do today. So each dot is an individual camera trap survey in a landscape, with green dots indicating camera trap surveys that took place in forested areas, yellow dots indicating largely grassland areas, and orange dots indicating desert areas. The background layer there is a map of vegetation density, with dark grey being high vegetation density, sort of lighter grey in patches there medium, light grey low vegetation density, and very low being white. So to put all of this into context, and we gathered all of these surveys together, we have 338 spatially independent landscapes from one another, and that accounts for 217 surveys in forests, 65 in grasslands, and 63 in deserts. So a really massive amount of effort gathered from across the country. In terms of the distribution of predators within that scheme, there's a lot of different numbers here, but what I want to really highlight is that for these models to work, we need a different gradient of predators on their own, predators in different pairwise combinations, and all three together to really tease apart the mechanisms that are driving their interactions and abundance. So for the individual predators, we've got relatively good estimates. Unfortunately, we only have two landscapes, so we get dingoes and foxes. And that's because a lot of our grassland surveys come from the north of the country where you don't get foxes. And then we have other areas which are quite good, like foxes and cats, for example. And we have about 40 sites with all three predators co-occurring together at once. So the first topic I'm going to talk about, as I alluded to earlier, is do predators segregate along environmental gradients? But to understand that, we're going to use an analysis method called a Royal-Nichols model. And what that is a hierarchical model that means you correct the abundance of the animal, accounting for detection probability. Now, a really easy example of detection probability is if you look in a fish tank, you know your fish is there. It's not gone anywhere. But you say you see it 1 in 10 times, that means you have a detection probability of 0.1. You know it's there, it can't escape, but you've just simply failed to detect it on that time you've walked past and looked at it. So we're correcting our state abundance of the animal using these methods. by creating a presence-absence matrix, where we have a series of columns with sites on the row, and then the column indicates the occasion. So in this case, we use 5 days for our occasion window. 1 indicates the animal was detected there, 0 not. And what this produces is a probability of site occupancy based on environmental variables. So the environmental variables we chose to use in the model selection process, and we used Akaki's information criterion to choose the best fitting model for the species, were human footprint index, elevation, habitat integrity assessments, rainfall, temperature, and habitat type. Now, taking a step back, I was speaking there about detectability and its effect on processes, but what I wanted to show you was what the patterns could look like if you just used a relative abundance index without accounting for detectability. So this shows a super interesting pattern. So on the y-axis of all of these graphs is the encounter rate. That's the number of independent photographic events separated by half an hour of each species divided by the total camera trap effort in days in a biome times 100. So that's the number of events per 100 trap nights for cats, dingoes, and foxes. Greens being forest, yellow being grassland, and orange being deserts. And what we've got here is a really interesting pattern where it seems like both cats and foxes do really well in the forest biome and the desert biome, whereas dingoes seem to be preferring that grassland and are just about holding on in the desert and sort of middling in the forest. So if you're just using relative abundance index as a sort of metric, you could infer at this point, well, dingoes are clearly keeping the cats down in the desert, and everywhere that dingoes are in lower abundance, the middle guys are doing well. But we think that could be a spurious pattern, and we're going to go into other methods to look at that and maybe explain why. So in terms of environmental segregation, the feral cat's top model was something called the Habitat Condition Assessment System. It's a score from 0 to 1, with 0 indicating that your habitat is really disturbed and very modified by mankind, and 1 indicating that the habitat is basically intact and as it should be since thousands of years ago. The predicted occupancy on the y-axis ranges from 0 to 1. 0 being we predict the predator is absent from that particular environmental variable, 1 being they occupy all sites. So drawing that to its logical conclusion, if we hit 0.5 on occupancy at 0.5 in habitat condition, we could infer that at 0.5 habitat condition, 1 in 2 sites are occupied by your predator. Now for feral cats, we have this nice positive linear relationship, which was somewhat surprising, where it seems like cats actually prefer more intact landscapes versus these more man-made disturbed ones. What I would have expected is that there was a peak somewhere in the middle with them preferring an intermediate level of disturbance versus intactness. It gets even stranger when we look at foxes. You see this really big noticeable decline, with foxes actually preferring really disturbed landscapes and not preferring intact ones at all. Now, you could think that this is due to maybe intact systems looking like closed, dense forests, which is partially true, but the habitat condition assessment score spans all of Australia. So deserts actually score really highly on that system and usually achieve around a 1 because there's no infrastructure development in deserts. So it's not a habitat split that we're seeing, it's actually a relationship with habitat disturbance. Now, tying all of that back to the dingo, if we put the relationship between dingoes and the habitat condition assessment, firstly, I want to point out this was not significant for dingoes. The top model was something else, but we're just plotting it on here to illustrate how dingoes respond to it in relation to the mesopredators. Dingoes didn't really care. They were pretty much universally quite highly abundant at around 0.75, regardless of habitat condition. We can also see there's lots of overlap between the mesopredators and the dingoes, and we would expect if we were seeing environmental segregation, very different trajectories on these lines with no overlap between them to illustrate some sort of environmental gradient driving that segregation between the species. What this infers to me is that we've actually found limited evidence of environmental segregation between our predators across Australia. And I would have expected that in the middle would have been the sweet spot for all of them, because previous studies have found associations with linear features like roads and solid habitat edges, driving that relationship where cats and foxes prefer those sort of environments because it maximizes your ability to hunt and move through the landscape. But we found the opposite, with some species like cats actually preferring intact environments altogether. Overall, this suggests that they're all co-occurring and that we can't really use environmental gradients as a reason to describe why we're not seeing a pattern of dingoes suppressing fox and cat. So now we move into the second hypothesis, which is centered around predation or interference competition based on dominance. So what we're looking at here is there any evidence that the abundance of dingoes influences the abundance of foxes and cats? And importantly, what we wanted to understand is there any evidence that these relationships are different in forests, grasslands, and deserts? Now, the reason we think that these relationships might be different is driven by habitat structure. So animals like cats and dingoes might be better able to avoid, not cats and foxes, sorry, too many dogs in this talk, Cats and foxes might be better able to avoid dingoes in more structurally complex habitats. It's quite a common theory in the literature. So to get at this question, we use something called a hierarchical co-abundance model. Now I'm going to give a very quick overview of that, but if you really want to see it, there was a CBCS talk by Zach Amir on this topic that really dives into the nitty-gritty of it. But in short, it's in the same family of models as the Royal Nichols occupancy model I used in the first section, but it takes count data instead of just using that binary presence absence 1, 0, which allows a much more richly informative model to actually then say, is the number of of your dominant predator affecting the number of your subordinate? It's a really useful model in that we have to a priori define who is going to be dominant, who is subordinate in the system. We're not assuming an interaction that could go either way, which seems logical. I don't see a reason to think why a cat could repel a dingo, for example. I think defining a dominance hierarchy is important. And it also allows us to use sites where the predator wasn't detected at all to define the model and better inform what could be driving them being absent from that particular environment. So what the numbers that we derived are going to show is the number of individuals per sampling unit. So when I say sampling unit, we spatially resampled all of our data to 10 kilometers squared, assuming that this would allow us to stay in the threshold for spatial independence between our sites. So it's going to be the number of animals per 10 km squared. And we accounted for the variables of human footprint index, elevation as a proxy for temperature and rainfall, and the habitat disturbance index, given its importance for foxes and cats in the previous model. Now, in terms of the results from the co-abundance model, they're quite complicated, but in total, we ran 16 models covering our 3 different habitats, 3 different species, and assuming different dominance conditions. So we allowed everyone to be sub and dominant in the interactions. The astute among you might say, well, that should be 18 models then. We actually couldn't run models between foxes and dingoes in grasslands because we had insufficient fox detections in grasslands because our data comes from the Northern Territory. And what I think the most surprising result here was all models between dingoes and mesopredators were positive, inferring a positive relationship between dingoes, cats, and foxes. Other models that support or did not really make that much sense, so I'm not going to cover them any further. But I'm now going to come on to the interesting models from the perspective of our question about dingoes and mesopredators. So our y-axis here shows mesopredator abundance. So this is the number of individuals per 10 kilometers squared. And the x shows dingo abundance, again, at that same scale, number per 10 kilometers squared. So what you can see here in the purple is cat abundance, and what you can see in the grey is fox abundance in forested habitats. And what's really surprising here is it's a positive relationship. So as one goes up, the other 2 are going up, but this is only from the perspective of dingoes to cats, dingoes to foxes. Again, in grassland, as I said earlier, we only had enough data for cats, so you can see cats are again increasing with dingoes. And in the deserts, we also see a similar pattern with cats and foxes increasing with dingo abundance, albeit none of these models are significant. You can see there's lots of overlap between the error bars. There's a shoot up of the foxes here, and that generally means that there's a variable operating within the system that we haven't accounted for, and it's potentially a spurious correlation. And what we think is happening there is something likely driven by prey. But all in all, I think this creates a fairly sort of comprehensive picture at this stage in the project, that there is a positive relationship between the mesopredators and the dingoes, and there's not really any evidence of a suppressive effect of dingoes on mesopredators. So to wrap all of this up in a sort of nice conclusion about co-abundance, habitats that are good for dingoes for some reason seem to also be good for mesopredators. This could be something as simple as habitats that have lots of prey for dingoes are also full of prey for cats and foxes. There could be some slightly more interesting mechanisms going on. For example, dingoes killing kangaroos, they'll leave behind the carcass, which then allows mesopredators to gain access to a food resource they wouldn't otherwise be able to bring down themselves. And this happens in other countries. In North America, wolves bring down caribou and then they leave the carcass behind, and foxes are actually able to go and feed on those carcasses and show a positive increase in their population. So it's not a fanciful suggestion, it's something quite logical. And when you look at dietary studies of both mesopredators, you can see evidence of carrion in their diets. However, I would follow this up with, we definitely need more data from specific areas. What we need is data from grassland, where foxes and dingoes co-occur. And we're also going to need more data on the dietary overlap of these species, as we think the prey is going to provide something really important in painting the picture of those models to try and fill out some of those crazy peaks and wider confidence intervals to see if the relationship still holds. Now, in terms of temporal niche differentiation, we wanted to understand, are the predators active at different times of day? And does the presence or absence of the dominant predator within a landscape affect the activity pattern of the subordinates? So when the dingo is present in the landscape, do foxes and cats change their activity patterns in response to this? To look at that, we use an analysis method called kernel density analysis, where you take the number of independent photographic events, plot it on a graph to make a curve, and then measure the overlap between the different species to understand when they're active and the evidence of overlap between them. And to simplify this a little bit, we used open versus closed habitat based on the vegetation density raster I showed you, where we sampled all of the data and split the vegetation density at the median. Anything that falls above the median is closed habitat, anything below it is more open. And that was just to keep this a bit simpler, because if you've got 3 habitat types, 3 co-occurring predators, 2 or 3 different combinations, it starts getting quite overwhelming and difficult to interpret. So I'm going to talk through each of these graphs quite slowly, because there's a lot going on, but it's quite intuitive once you get the hang of it. So on the bottom axis, we have the time of day split into noon, sunset, midnight, sunrise, noon. So the white areas are diurnal activity during the day. Light grey is crepuscular, so dusk and dawn. And then dark grey is activity focused in the night. Now for each of these, the blue line shown here, it overlaps with the green one, but the blue one here is the activity of pattern of feral cats in landscapes where the dingo was never detected. So that's across all of the surveys, a dingo was never detected in that landscape. You can see the activity pattern of the cat here, and they're generally sort of quite similar to a dingo, really, relatively diurnal, mainly nocturnal with a little peak at dawn and then declining again. And what the green line is showing you is the activity pattern of the dingo. Now, where this gets super interesting is when you introduce the landscapes where dingoes were detected, which is this red line here. And what you can see is that when dingoes were detected in the landscape, we're actually seeing a reduction in feral cat diurnal activity. That goes down by around 12% if you measure the difference in the height of the lines, and around a 15% increase in nocturnal activity. These numbers in the top corner here are the level of temporal overlap. So a value of 1 here indicates total overlap. There's not really much difference in the activity patterns at all. They're basically identical. 0 would indicate total dissimilarity. They're not the same at all. So, and that number is measuring between the red line and the blue line. So what we can see is it's almost a relatively fine scale shift of cats just becoming less diurnally active, but much more nocturnally active. But we're not seeing that big swap of cats saying, okay, great, if dingoes aren't here, I'm becoming diurnal because that's what I'm going to make, get the most kills. And then if we go across to the open habitat types, we see that relationship, these relationships again. So we've got the blue being the cat activity pattern, the green being dingo. And what I want you to notice here is that if you compare the activity density profiles, everyone is much more nocturnally active in more open habitats, which makes sense. It's probably going to be much hotter in an open habitat compared to a closed one. And again, where this gets interesting is if you introduce the landscapes where the dingo was detected compared to not. So again, blue line, cat activity when dingoes aren't present in a landscape. Red line, cat activity when dingoes are present in a landscape. And again, we see that consistent 15% increase in nocturnal activity when dingoes are present, versus around a 12% decrease in diurnal activity when dingoes are present. So you can see those decreases in the lines there. So then if we move on to foxes and dingoes, again, I know this seems a bit repetitive, but I'll keep repeating it, is that foxes are the blue line in landscapes where dingoes aren't detected. You've got this peak in activity at around sunset, and they sort of decline in activity throughout the night and are slightly diurnal, but not that diurnal. And then you've got the dingoes here in the green. And what we see again in the yellow is fox activity in a landscape where a dingo is detected. And we see that a really big decrease in diurnal activity, still at about 12%, but foxes basically just aren't active in the day anymore when a dingo is present in the landscape. And they're much more nocturnal with this sort of very different activity pattern, but still quite high overlap. So they're not switching to diurnal activity, they're staying nocturnal, just adjusting that peak to maybe be most active when the dingo is least active in the night. Now, if we look at open habitat again, everyone is much more nocturnally active as a general pattern. But if we bring in that yellow line again, where we've got fox activity in landscapes where dingoes were detected versus fox activity in landscape where dingoes were not detected, we again see around a 20% shift and increase in nocturnal activity versus a 10% decrease in diurnal activity. So overall, to sort of wrap all of those complicated figures up into a few sentences, regardless of habitat structure, it seems like dingoes push both foxes and cats towards being more nocturnal in all habitats. And interestingly, all predators are more nocturnal in these open habitats. So that paints a pretty bleak picture for sort of nocturnal wildlife in the deserts of Australia, where you've suddenly got this big predation pressure from everyone co-occurring and being more active at night. Interestingly, from the perspective of our theory, where dingoes are going to be our biodiversity regulator, creating a temporal refuge for native fauna, there's actually limited predator free time during the day. When dingoes are present, they occupy that diurnal niche. When dingoes aren't present, cats and foxes just seem to fill it. So what this really means is that it doesn't seem like by introducing dingoes, we're going to create a temporal refugia. And actually it could just enter a situation of hyperpredation where regardless of the time of day you're active as an Australian species, there's always going to be a predator about. So to sort of wrap all of this up in broad, punchy, hopefully, one-sentence conclusions, we didn't find any evidence that our predator species were segregating themselves along environmental gradients at all. That surprisingly, counter to quite a lot of predictions, dingo, fox, and cat abundance appear to be positively linked. This means that what areas that are good for dingoes are good for foxes and cats. And then we have no evidence in this data set of a suppressive effect on dingoes on either of these mesopredators. And that foxes and cats change their temporal activity pattern, probably to reduce their overlap with dingoes to becoming more nocturnal in the presence of the dingo in the landscape. So as I sort of alluded to earlier, there's a lot of different lines of evidence that people argue, and I think these make some quite compelling stories. Firstly, to support our findings, historically, dingoes did not prevent the spread of mesopredators. So if you go back to early on in the presentation, dingoes were here thousands of years before foxes and cats even arrived on the continent. And even though they had already established themselves, they couldn't stop the spread of foxes and cats to basically the whole country. You'd have thought if there was a really noticeable effect, dingoes maybe could have prevented them from spreading at all to begin with. I think a nice line to think about this is that actually cats and foxes come from places where you have a canid apex predator anyway. They come from systems with wolves. What this means is they have an appropriate set of behavioral strategies to avoid being eaten by a wolf or a dog type predator in the first place. And that partially explains why Australian native fauna are so vulnerable to foxes and cats, is they don't have that appropriate behavioral response to avoid the predator. So basically, cats and foxes have evolved with a top predator, and they're likely to be pretty good at avoiding being eaten. And finally, a sort of depressing statement for everyone hoping for a nice answer for this. There is limited evidence based on sort of predator ecological theory that we have spatial or temporal refugia for native fauna driven by altering the abundance of an apex predator in a system. Now, we've still got a lot left to do, and like I said, these results are preliminary, so they could change, but I'm pretty confident in a lot of the things we found. What we look at next is an in situ dominance hierarchy, and starting to look into, as I alluded to earlier, food is going to be important. Indirect competition, like scramble competition, are predators eating all of the resources before another one can get there, or indirect facilitation, like that carcass provisioning. So to do that, we're going to use something called structural equation modeling, which is much better at getting into these more not stochastic is one word, but that's not the word I'm looking for. I mean ephemeral effects, so ephemeral vegetation, boom and bust systems in the desert. By using a structural equation model, you can actually start to account for things like a big grass boom, allowing lots more prey species, and so on, to then understand how the dingo and feral cat and red fox interactions change in light of these events. I think dietary overlap is going to be very important, and we're reviewing the literature currently on that. I think the reason for that is that if you have lots of predators all eating the same thing, altering the population of one might just allow another to fill that gap and eat more of those prey species. In terms of current research on fox, dingo, and cat diets in Australia, it seems that in the wetter parts of the country, there's actually more dietary overlap between these species. Generally, they focus on the little guys like bandicoots, pademelons, that sort of thing. But as you move into arid Australia, in the times of like when there's good abundance of vegetation, dingoes are actually better able to eat larger species like kangaroos, which is a better reward for a kill than a small species like a bandicoot, leaving the cats and foxes to focus on the mice. What this means is that areas like that, you might be able to achieve some protection of little guys like mice by managing fox and cat populations, but in areas where everyone's eating the same thing, changing the levels of abundance of predators might not do very much at all. And finally, as I'm sure you're all aware, there's lots of different management on the different predator populations across Australia, and you'll probably notice that I didn't include that as a variable in the current modelling. So we've got things like predator-proof fences built sort of cutting off whole parts of Australia. You've got the ARC project in Victoria, removing foxes by poison baiting from entire landscapes. So we really want to incorporate that into our co-abundance models, along with the prey species, to see how these positive effects or negative effects are changing. And we're just awaiting updates for collaborators on control efforts at their sites. This isn't always obvious if it's happened. I only know about control efforts at my sites because I helped monitor them during my PhD, whereas somebody else going there tomorrow would probably have no idea that some poisoning had occurred there at all. So it's really important to consider, and we're definitely going to look into it. So I just wanted to say a big thank you to everyone at WildObs, who are the first group listed here, but also a massive thank you to the data contributors and co-authors. There's about 60 of you, and I'm going to follow that up with, if anyone listening to this talk has more data and is interested in being involved, we're welcoming more people, and we want to rerun all of these models with a larger data set. Thank you. Any questions?